Hello everybody, it's been a while since I made a video. It was a very busy Christmas and then it's just hard to get back into the flow of things again. But what I have here today is we've been selling for a while the RealSimGear G1000 suite that does a real nice job of simulating the G1000 in X-Plane. But what I have here is the Virtual Fly G1000 suite. And it's quite interesting because the way these devices work, the RealSimGear and the Virtual Fly, are very, very, very similar. And what I want to talk about is kind of a multi-stage, sort of overview or review, where I talk about, the hardware and the software and how well they work, and I bring Austin in as well to talk about it. But right now I want to talk about the physical connections and how they work. Now, mounted in here, you'll see we have the PFD and the MFD, and then we have the audio panel here in the middle. And RealSimGear has a very similar type bezel type thing that you can get that's very similar to this and hooks everything up, and it looks from the front very similar. I don't currently have the RealSimGear mounted in that. And of course, around back is where I wanted to talk today about some of the differences. So the way the Virtual Fly one works is fairly similar to the RealSimGear, but back here you'll see we have these switches, PFD or MFD. So you can make this device a PFD or an MFD based on where you put this switch. But and I'm just talking about the kind of differences here because these products are so similar. On the RealSimGear, it depends on what firmware you load it with. So if you load it with PFD firmware, it's a PFD. If you load it with MFD firmware, it's an MFD. At least as far as I can tell, there's no other differences between the two devices. But there is no physical switch on the back of the RealSimGear to toggle between the two. Now, the way the power is delivered is a little bit different on the RealSimGear versus the Virtual Fly. The Virtual Fly has a single 12-volt in, and then it daisy chains the power from here over to here, out of here, and then over to here. And so you use a single 12-volt, and then it daisy chains across and powers all of these devices, all three devices, with 12-volt power. On the RealSimGear, which I'll show you in a minute, that has an individual power supply for each, the PFD and the MFD, and then it also has a ribbon cable that connects the audio panel. Now, the way the Virtual Fly connects is with HDMI here and here, but they also curiously include a VGA connection. D-sub is what some people call it. I sometimes call it analog VGA because it's an analog signal. Most people are going to want to use the HDMI on each of these devices, but it does have VGA, which is a little bit unusual. Now lastly, how they connect to the computer. Each of these devices has its own USB port. So we have a USB here, and here, and here. So it uses 3 USB ports, one for the PFD, one for the MFD, and one for the audio panel. Hopefully you're not getting too much glare there with that. Now, that's how the Virtual Fly device hooks up. Let's look now at the RealSimGear. So this, I don't have it mounted in one of their bezels, but this is the PFD/MFD, whichever one you want to call it. They look identical. I have another one here, but again, they're identical. Now, on the back, you may like this more or dislike this, but there are no physical ports on the flat part of the back. The HDMI and the power are right over here. So you have an HDMI and a 12-volt power coming in the bottom. So for some people's panels, that's better, and for some people's panels, that might be worse. Because on the back of the Virtual Fly, you've got to have some clearance here for the HDMI cable to come out, or and the power cable to come out, and the USB cable to come out. But here, we've got USB, HDMI, and power. It's a pain in the butt to plug these in, but you have a nice flat back here that you're not having to worry about, you know, clearance. And then also, once this is installed in a panel, you might actually find it easier to plug things in and out if they're along the bottom. So it's sort of an ergonomics thing. You know, some people would prefer this and some people would prefer the plugs be, you know, right there on the back. Also mentioned there's no switch to switch between PFD and MFD on this device. It depends on what firmware is loaded. Now we also have an audio panel with this device. Oh, here it is. Here's the audio panel, and it connects via this rainbow colored ribbon cable. And so on the back of it, you see there's this little ribbony area that you plug this ribbon cable into. And then on the back of either the PFD or the MFD, you have, where is it? Right here, a place where the ribbon cable plugs in. And that's how this gets its signal. Now, if you remember, on the Virtual Fly device, this device has its own USB connection and it gets 12-volt power separately. And whereas on this device it uses this, I guess you'd call it a proprietary ribbon cable. Nothing wrong with either way, just a different way of doing it, but the RealSimGear will use one less USB connection. Now, one other thing that's different about these devices, the RealSimGear, when you plug it in, but all these devices, these are monitors. This screen here is a monitor to your computer. But on the RealSimGear, it's upside down. So you have to go into the Windows display properties and flip it. And I'm sure there's some design reason why. I mean, they wouldn't just do it that way just to be annoying. I'm sure it has something to do with how all the wiring inside hooks up. It makes it easier if they flip the screen upside down. But it is something you have to do in the Windows display properties, is to flip this to, sorry about all the noise, landscape flipped in the display properties to make it work. Now, in the end, these both work with X-Plane, both Virtual Fly and RealSimGear, in a very similar manner. They all are considered monitors, and on all of these, you drag your G1000 screens down to these displays. They both use a plug-in to communicate with X-Plane. So when you turn this knob or push the button in or whatever, X-Plane knows what you're doing. So the way they go about things is very, very similar in their communication with X-Plane. But where they actually are quite different is really in the physicality of the things, how the ports connect and all that. Also, you may or may not be able to tell here, but the Virtual Fly device is deeper. It's probably 2 inches deep, whereas this is more like 1 inch deep if you're looking at it from the side. Don't know if that matters a ton to most people, but it is. Let me see if I can turn this and give you that idea. So it goes from here to here is the total depth, whereas the total depth on the RealSimGear, minus the knobs of course, is about this much. So it's about double the depth for the Virtual Fly. So these are real minor things, and you may say, well gosh, these are really, you know, trivial things you're pointing out. But the reason I'm doing that is because the differences are pretty small between these devices. Now, one area where there is a big difference is how the buttons and the knobs feel. They feel quite different on the two devices. Now, I don't own a plane that has these, but Austin does. So I plan to have Austin do a separate video, which will be forthcoming, where he talks about the feel. So the way these things work, very, very similar. What you're going to find the biggest difference, at least for me, between these two devices is going to be feel. The feel of the buttons, the clickiness, how much noise they make, how much they click when you turn the knobs. And that's what we'll bring Austin in and have him talk about. And hopefully that'll be pretty soon. So there's a physical overview of the RealSimGear G1000 versus the Virtual Fly G1000. And we will have more to come on this. Just stay tuned.